This question is so old that people living in different parts of the world have tried to answer it in different ways. But interestingly, in the three major Abrahamic religions, the same name always appears: Adam. The classic story we all know is more or less the same. Adam is the first human, and humanity descends from him. But what if, for a moment, we consider a different possibility? What if Adam was not actually the name of a single person? What if, over time, the original meaning of the word was forgotten and it was passed down to us only as the name of the first human? Because the interesting part starts right here. When we look at this issue more deeply, what appears is not just a single person, but perhaps a much broader idea representing all of humanity. According to the story told for centuries, God creates humans, in some versions from clay, in others from water, and in different forms in other accounts. Similar stories are found not only in Abrahamic religions, but also in many ancient cultures, from the Sumerians to Indian civilizations. Of course, our goal here is not to argue which narrative is true or false. After all, there is a reality called humanity, and naturally people have wondered about its origins. Some call it divine creation, some call it evolution, and some may consider both perspectives together. This is entirely a personal approach. What we are actually curious about today is the meaning behind the story, because sometimes the most interesting part is not the story itself, but the meanings carried by the words used. Now let's come to the interesting part. When we hear the name Adam, most of us imagine the same image, the first human. But some researchers in linguistic studies suggest another possibility. Maybe Adam was not originally a single individual, but a concept representing all of humanity. One of the first clues comes from Hebrew. In Hebrew, the word Adam does not only refer to a specific person, it can also mean human, or humanity, in a general sense. For example, in the creation section of the Torah, the word used when God creates humans is again Adam. And here it does not refer to a single person, but to humanity created as male and female. This raises an interesting question. Could a word that originally described a species have gradually turned into the name of an individual? Another striking point is the connection of the word with soil. In Hebrew, the word adamah means soil, and Adam is phonetically very close to it. In other words, a direct connection seems to be made between humans and soil. In creation narratives, the idea that humans were created from soil frequently appears. In Arabic as well, a similar situation exists. According to some interpretations, the word Adam is associated with the earth, soil, or the surface of the world. Because of this, some thinkers suggest that what is being referred to is not just a name, but the idea of a human coming from the earth. The interesting part does not end here. When we go back to older civilizations like the Sumerians and Akkadians, we encounter similar concepts. In some texts, words like adamah are used to describe humanity. That is, rather than a specific individual, they refer to a created group. When we put all these pieces together, a different perspective emerges. Perhaps the story of Adam was never the biography of a single person. Perhaps it was a symbolic narrative explaining humanity's origin, its relationship with the world, and its existence. Of course, instead of reaching a definite conclusion here, it is more reasonable to consider different possibilities. Because history, language, and belief are often intertwined, sometimes even a single word can take us to very different places than expected. Now let's look at the narratives in sacred texts, because things become even more interesting here. Some readers who carefully examine the book of Genesis notice a small but important detail. The creation story is not told in just one way. There are two different accounts that are similar, but differ in details. In the first account, we see a broader and more structured picture. God creates humans, and male and female come into existence together. Here the focus is more on the creation of humanity. But in the second account, the story becomes more personal. This time we see a single human formed from soil. Then comes the creation of his partner, the garden, the forbidden tree, and other familiar events. The story most of us know from childhood is generally based on this second version. Some researchers ask the following question. Could it be that the story originally described the emergence of humanity, but over time became more individualized? because some linguistic studies suggest that the original expressions referred not to a specific name, but to humanity in general. Then we come to the story of Cain and Abel, and here again some points attract attention. According to the traditional narrative, there are very few people in the world, Adam, Eve, and their children. But after Cain kills his brother and leaves, he goes to another place, marries, and builds a city there. Naturally, people ask, where did those people come from? At this point, some commentators propose a different perspective. If we consider Adam not as a single individual, but as a broader concept representing humanity, some parts begin to look different. Of course, this does not mean this is definitely the truth, because matters of faith and historical interpretation do not always align. What matters here is this. Sometimes, instead of reading ancient texts only with modern meanings, it is necessary to try to understand them within the language and mindset of the time they were written. Because a word used thousands of years ago may have had a much broader meaning than we assume today. Now let's also look at the Qur'anic perspective, because there are also some striking points here. The narrative most of us have in mind is quite clear. Adam is the first human, Eve is his wife, and the story begins like this. However, some who examine the Qur'anic text more closely focus on different details. For example, many people assume that the name Eve, Hava, is explicitly mentioned in the Quran. But interestingly, the name Hava does not directly appear in the Quran. Instead, expressions like Adam and his spouse are used. This seemingly small detail attracts attention for some people, because the focus here seems to be less on specific names and more on the human being and the process they go through. Another notable point is the narrative style used in some verses. For example, in some places we see expressions like, "We created you" in plural form. This has been interpreted in different ways throughout history. Some say this is a form of majesty in Arabic, while others have proposed different interpretations. What matters here is that in ancient texts, words do not function like everyday modern speech. A single word can carry multiple meanings at once. Then there is the story of the expulsion from paradise. We usually hear it in a very simple way from childhood. A forbidden fruit is eaten and then humans are expelled from paradise. But some commentators think this may be a more symbolic narrative. Because in ancient stories, a tree may not only mean a literal tree. In some cultures, a tree symbolizes lineage, knowledge, or life itself. For this reason, some people interpret this story not as a literal fruit, but as a symbolic representation of humanity encountering knowledge, choice, and responsibility. Of course, it is difficult to reach absolute conclusions here. Because at this point, history, language, belief, and interpretation all merge. But one thing can be said. When we look at a story only from the surface, we see one thing. When we go deeper, we may encounter completely different meanings. Perhaps this is exactly what people have been debating for centuries about Adam. Not just the story of a single person, but a story of humanity trying to understand its own existence. When we bring all these pieces together, an interesting picture emerges. Whether you approach it from a religious perspective, a historical perspective, or through ancient civilizations' narratives, the word Adam seems to carry a meaning beyond just a single individual. Perhaps what is being told here is not just the life story of one person, but a larger symbolic narrative of humanity's journey in the world. On one side, there is the idea of humans coming from soil. On the other, there is the idea of humans encountering knowledge, making choices, and beginning to shape their own story. Interestingly, when you look at the roots of the word and the narratives of different civilizations, some common points begin to appear. Of course, all of this does not mean this is the absolute truth, because in fields like history, religion, and mythology, it is often not easy to find a single answer. In fact, what matters is not choosing a side, but continuing to ask questions, because sometimes even examining a single word more deeply can take a person to unexpected places. Maybe the reason these stories have been discussed for centuries is exactly that, because the topic is not only Adam, the topic is also, in a way, human beings themselves. Who we are, where we come from, and why we are here,